I began this vlog with a goal of challenging the misinformation that swirls around about dementia and to provide real information about what it's like to live with this disease. So one day I was talking with a group of friends and the subject of dementia came up. And one person said, quite loudly as I recall, "If I got Alzheimer's, I would shoot myself." I decided not to respond. But I know this is not a death sentence. They say if you've met someone living with Alzheimer's disease, you've met one person living with Alzheimer's disease, meaning there are many different outcomes. For some, the disease progresses faster. For others, it's more transformative. Everyone has a different response. Over in the UK, Frances Lawrence's mother was diagnosed with the disease at age 62. Frances became her main care partner, or carer as they're sometimes called in the UK. It was a difficult time. Her mother declined quickly and resisted the care she needed.
So right up to the end, she still knew who people were, and she could present very well when she needed to, particularly in front of healthcare professionals. And so whenever healthcare professionals would be coming out or social workers would be coming out to assess my mum, she would almost have this massive energy to pull herself together to be able to show to the social workers that she was okay. And it was far from that. And, you know, living away, you know, I lived an hour away from my mum, so working full-time, commuting in and out of London, trying to do everything that I could for my mum, it was exhausting. And it felt like dealing with social services, it felt like you were hitting your head against a brick wall at every single turn, and it didn't feel like people wanted to help you. It felt like people wanted to tick some boxes, say they'd done their thing, pass you on and leave you to it. I fell out with my sister. She and I had very different views of how things should be dealt with, and I guess my sister found it much more challenging than I did, so I felt that a lot of the burden fell on me. And I don't use that word burden lightly, because you never want to think of family as burden, but it was a massive, massive burden. And later it also led to other kind of divisions in the family. When it was time for mum to go into a care home, one of her brothers in particular, who was just 1 year younger than her, was adamant that she should be staying at home and we should be paying for 24/7 care in her home. That wasn't an option. That wasn't financially viable for me and my sister at the time. It wasn't something that we could have done. And so, yeah, the whole experience just felt like a brutal whirlwind. If you can call something that lasts 5 years a whirlwind, I don't know, but it sort of took you in, spat you out the other side, and it's only a couple of years, or 3 years on now, since mum's death, that you're sort of able to properly process everything that you went through as a carer.
Next week, I'll talk about my experience of treatment with Leqembi. And then I also want to report in on my status. How am I doing after a year? Have I changed? And if so, how? Stay tuned and keep dancing, folks. Hi, George King here with the blog Dancing with Delirium. This week, I'd like to talk about what it's like living with this disease. Have I noticed any degeneration, any changes? Living with a degenerative disease, there are two possible outcomes: no change or deterioration. So I'm constantly on the lookout for indications of change. Not obsessively, I know where that can lead, but vigilant. What have I noticed? Well, to begin on a positive note, I think I'm actually calmer. 18 months ago, my short-term memory was poor enough for me to seek medical advice. It hasn't changed, but I have. As I've adjusted to living with this disease, I'm less hampered with the concerns and suspicions. I know the answer. The diagnosis has helped to explain things. My short-term memory, which is now an apparently minuscule storage space in my brain, retains information for about half a second, then it's gone. You're probably familiar with that trope about aging brains. You walk into a room and forget why. Usually, retracing your steps to the last thing you were doing jogs the memory. When this occurred, I would be frustrated and irritated. Now, it's merely an amusing moment. Oh, that's what it is. That's what's going on. It's almost like meeting an old friend. Ah, there you are. On the other side of the ledger, I'm noticing a degree of occasional uncertainty in daily life. Here's one example. I'm driving and I come to a traffic light or a stop sign. Momentarily, I find myself confused. I know where I'm going, but how to get there? Is it right, left, straight on? Within a few seconds, the answer comes to me and I continue on my way. This has happened perhaps 3 or 4 times in the past year, so not exactly a crisis, but perhaps a harbinger. And a note on driving for those of you who had heart palpitations hearing the last paragraph. Impairment is not the same as incapacity. I'm still a skilled and considerate driver, but I recognize that may change at some point. So periodically, I drive with a passenger to monitor my driving skills, and I've slowed down to scrupulously observe speed limits and such. I remember the day I had to persuade my father to hand over his car keys, but that's a story for another day. I'm going to continue with this next week. Meanwhile, dance on, my friends. Hi, George King back with part 2 of my assessment of my current condition. But first, a few words about aging. One of the things you may have noticed is, as we age, our self-perception really doesn't. Meaning, in many respects, we still believe that we're the same person we always were, warts and all. Looking into the faces of our elders, you can often catch a flash of that person in their youth, particularly when their facial muscles are animated by laughter or other emotions. Our bodies age, and we may lose some strength and capacity, but in our minds, we're still the same person we were 30 years ago. It's an adjustment to acknowledge the aging process, and many people fight it to the end, which actually makes perfect sense in a society where old age is not appreciated, venerated, or even respected. But then denial, avoidance, or proclaiming ignorance are not necessarily beneficial strategies for living out your 10. But back to whining. Occasionally, I encounter perceptual problems. Loud sound and discordant higher frequencies are unsettling and irritating to me. That's been around now for a year or two. And visually, I've noticed some misperceptions. Here's an example. A couple of weeks ago, I decided to make a fruitcake. Now, I'm fully aware of America's general distaste for the fruitcake, but let's put that aside for the time being. The recipe I selected required candied orange peel. I searched the website of our local grocery store and found they had some, so I trotted off to the store. However, this occurred during one of Atlanta's rare snow encounters, and the shelves were bare. So, grabbing 3 oranges, I thought, I'll just make the candied peel myself. Back in the kitchen, I carefully cut through the peel with a paring knife, leaving the orange intact. I repeated this with the 2 other oranges. Then I removed the peel from the first one and reached for the second. But the other 2 oranges were untouched. There were no cut marks. It made no sense. I distinctly remember cutting 3 oranges. I remember how bored I was by the time I got to the third one. I was stunned, but the evidence lay before me. I know it happened, but it didn't. My memory and perception apparently remembered things differently. Now, this might sound trivial, but I assure you I was genuinely shocked at the time. Nevertheless, I successfully candied the orange peel, and the cake was great. Stop by for a slice if you're in the neighborhood. If not, I'll see you on the dance floor. Okay, part 3 of my self-assessment. And if you've had enough of this self-absorption, stop back next week. I promise a different tack, perhaps another guest. But concluding my account of personal mysteries, a few days ago I walked past the kitchen counter and spotted Louise's keys. She was about to leave the house, so I shouted over, "Your keys are on the kitchen table!" And she walked into the kitchen and said, "Where? I can't see them." I walked back in and saw that what I'd mistaken for her keys on closer inspection didn't look remotely like them. But in that initial swift glance, my brain identified Louise's keys. My brain and I obviously need to get on the same page. And remember the oranges and the fruitcake from last week? If not, you might want to check it out before continuing. Well, yesterday I found myself in a conversation with neurologist and author Jason Karlawish. We met him earlier in the blog. He had invited me to participate in this podcast out of the University of Pennsylvania. I brought up the fruitcake incident, and here's an excerpt from that conversation. And Surreal is really what the orange thing was like.
I was going to say, that's exactly what I thought about. The keys in the orange are an example of what I think is a neglected aspect of the experience of this disease, Alzheimer's, which is the surreal.
Yes.
And indeed, I find myself, I don't terribly like surreal art. I just don't find it pleasant to the eye. And yet I've come to greatly appreciate the surreal and the abstract more because I think it helps me understand what it must be like to have this disease.
Confusion also arises sometimes in what I think of as information overload situations. Two nemeses that I encounter regularly are Mr. Refrigerator and Miss Spice Cupboard. In either situation, I'm faced with a bewildering array of choices. Materials, shapes, sizes, and colors collide in apparently confusing ways. How difficult could it be to find a jar of mint sauce in a refrigerator? The answer is extremely. Now, finding things was something I was actually good at in the past. I remember finding a single contact lens dropped by a girlfriend once on rough ground in a national park. But something has shifted. I attempt to keep order on the spice shelves, but a local demon is clearly reorganizing things while we sleep. I pretty much have to take out every item to find anything. Well, we'll wrap this up next week. Okay, now back to the Paso Doble. Well, back to YouTube, I guess.